You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Jeremy Horpedahl of the University of Central Arkansas. Jeremy, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Garrett.
So our topic for today is some work you've done on alcohol prohibition in Arkansas, in modern-day Arkansas, so not back in the 1920s, but now in 2018. Before we start, I think we should cover some of the background. Your work builds on the theory of bootleggers and Baptists, which is this metaphor that economists have used a long time. So how about you start by giving a background on the bootleggers and Baptist theory?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the framework I'm using here is sometimes called Bootleggers and Baptists, as you mentioned. It goes back to a short article that Bruce Yandel wrote in 1983 called Bootleggers and Baptists, the Education of a Regulatory Economist, I believe is the full title. And Yandel was trying to explain why certain laws or regulations get passed. And what Yandel says in this article is that you essentially need two types of groups to support a law in order for it to have a good chance of passing. So the first member of this coalition, you might call it, would be bootleggers. And Yandel uses this to mean anyone who has a financial stake in the outcome of the law passing. But in Yandel's kind of colorful example, he talks about bootleggers being people who make alcohol and sell alcohol illegally. And he was discussing what exists in a lot of states at the time, which are laws that don't allow liquor stores to be open on Sundays. So the bootlegger likes these laws because that allows him for at least 1 out of the 7 days every week to have some extra business that he might not have if there was no Sunday closing law. And then the other party to this coalition is what Yandel called Baptists, and Baptists would be any group that doesn't necessarily have a financial stake in the outcome, but they think the law is morally correct in some way. So this group is important not only because they need to be, have this coalition working together, but they essentially give the moral cover for this law to be passed. In fact, publicly, they're probably the only ones you'll ever see going on TV or talking to other people saying, this is important morally to have, in this example, liquor stores closed on Sundays because that's the Lord's Day. We want families to be spending time together and not drinking. So we want bars to be closed. We want liquor stores not to be open. And so these groups would come together, and it doesn't even necessarily have to mean they are explicitly working together, but they certainly work together in a way that people sometimes describe this as strange bedfellows. Why would these two groups, bootleggers and churchgoers, why would they be working together? Well, in this case, they do have a common outcome that they both seek, and that allows the law to have a better chance of passing or staying in place.
Right, because people make a big deal about lobbyists and campaign donations from big corporations or groups with special interests, but you never see a politician go on TV and say, "Yeah, I had to vote for this law because the industry it deals with gave me a lot of money, and I basically sold my vote to the highest bidder." And yet we have a pretty strong intuition that lobbying does have some effect.
Right. Yeah. There's a pretty large literature on what effect lobbying has, but there is a lot of evidence that it does have some effect, even at the margin of how politicians behave. But of course, politicians always try to downplay this, right? They would say, "Oh no, it's not because the NRA gave me money and voting this way. I was going to vote that way anyway." So they try to even downplay to the extent they mention any contributions they get. But they certainly are happy to play up any groups that are supporting them because they think it's the right thing to do.
Right. Often the politicians are themselves the Baptists, or they, or at least they, when they're writing their speeches and stuff, that's where they get their talking points from the moral crusaders, not from the special interests.
Yeah, absolutely. They're likely to try to make Baptist-like arguments themselves, and they would never say, "Well, I support this law because I will personally profit or because my donors will personally profit. They would never say that. And the arguments they make are going to sound very much like what we would call in this framework a Baptist would make.
So what's really interesting about your research is that since that 1983 paper, and presumably before, since the working paper or the first drafts were around, economists have been using bootleggers and Baptists as a metaphor for this overall process. So, we say, oh, it's a bootleggers and Baptist situation. The labor unions and the workplace safety activists are implicitly working together, or big agriculture and food security people or something. But what's so interesting about your work is that you, in your study of dry counties in Arkansas, have shown pretty much it's not a metaphor anymore. You've shown a pretty much literal bootleggers and Baptist coalition, and you've shown it with data. So tell me about that. How did you go about studying this?
Sure. So I can also give just a little bit of background about the paper itself. Mm-hmm. So what I'm looking at are, in Arkansas, we have 75 counties, and slightly fewer than half of them are still completely dry counties. But in these counties, you are allowed to, if you get enough signatures, hold an election to make the county wet to legalize alcohol sales. And what I've found, though, is that in all the cases I look at, you can get pretty good data on who's spending money on these, both for and against these campaigns to legalize alcohol sales. And in many of them, you got basically two groups that are donating to these. One are what I'll call the bootleggers here, but they're completely legal in this case. So here's where it's slightly different from the metaphor, but pretty close. The bootleggers here are liquor stores that are already open in bordering wet counties. So you have legal liquor stores fighting against alcohol legalization in neighboring counties. And then the Baptists are essentially, they are Baptists. They're churches. They're not all Baptist denominations, but Arkansas does have a large number of Baptists. So Baptists and other churches then are the Baptists in this example. And in many cases, it's either one or the other of them is donating to it. But of course, the bootleggers have a lot more money. But even in the cases where they're not both donating money, as I think we'll probably talk a little bit more, the churches are providing essentially the public face for the campaign. They're the ones that are talking to the newspapers. They're the ones that are going out and talking to citizens to get them to either not sign these petitions or to vote against it. So you've got a legal bootlegger, in a sense, the neighboring county liquor stores, oftentimes liquor stores being right on the border of the county, or at least they're in a neighboring county. And they have a very large financial stake in these neighboring dry counties staying dry. There's a couple of reasons for this. Not only have they picked a location that's right on the border, Arkansas has a number of other interesting alcohol regulations. One is that you can only own one liquor store. So chain liquor stores are not allowed. Walmart only has one liquor store in the entire state. So not only have you, picked this location and kind of invest a lot of money in it, a lot of times these are family-owned liquor stores, and this is their entire business, and they are entirely dependent upon people driving in from dry counties to buy from this wet county. They're not in a city. There's no real reason for them to be where they're located. So that's kind of the basics of what I'm looking at here.
Yeah, there's an element of spatial economics to it. So, for instance, gas stations often compete for location. If you can be, the first gas station on the highway off ramp, you can get a lot of the business from long distance travelers. And you can think about competition between gas stations as competition to be closer to people who need gas. And similarly with liquor stores, it's not, if your liquor store is competing with the liquor store that's a 10-minute drive away for the people who are between the two of you, but the people who are 1 minute a drive from you and a 9-minute drive from the other guy will probably come to you. And so having this whole area, being on the edge of this whole area with no competitors, gives you essentially, a large market to service.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's certainly the profit maximizing choice for them to be located, at this position. But if there's going to be a change in the rules, if there will now be legal sales in a county where they were not legal before, you're going to lose a lot of business. For a lot of these liquor stores, there's really no reason for anyone to stop there. So you change the rules, and then you change what's the optimal location for a store to be located, and there'll be winners and losers from this. Absolutely.
Right. Moving your liquor store is extremely costly. You need to shut down at your current location and buy a different location. Right. And so there's a very strong incentive to maintain the status quo. If you have, you're a small family business and you've invested a lot of your total wealth in this one venture that wouldn't be viable in the case of a change in the law. So you gave some background, but to be clear, these dry counties are dry because at the end of Prohibition nationwide, they stayed that way. So how historically did all these dry counties come about? They adopted Prohibition presumably when the rest of the country did, and then they just kept it thereafter?
Yeah, I'll give you some of the background. Actually, we'll go back really far. We'll go back before Prohibition, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah?
So Arkansas has a long history of letting counties and even jurisdictions below the county, cities, townships, has a long history of letting them vote on this. So before Prohibition, there were actually mandatory elections every 2 years in every county to vote on whether you would allow liquor sales or not. So you might think you get a lot of flip-flopping back and forth, but the way it worked out in Arkansas, at least, is that once a county voted itself dry, this is before national prohibition. Once they voted themselves dry, they basically never went wet again. They kind of stuck. They kind of liquor stores, I guess, or saloons would move to another location. They would no longer fight it there. Arkansas does adopt statewide prohibition just a couple years before national prohibition. Then, of course, after national prohibition ends, all the powers are returned to states to regulate alcohol. And Arkansas kind of does an interesting thing is after national prohibition ends, Arkansas chooses to make all of its counties wet again, but they then allow elections to be held if a county wants to go dry. So after prohibition, status quo in Arkansas is alcohol is legal everywhere, but you can hold an election. But one thing they do, and I think we'll talk about this, about the current status quo as well, is they change the threshold of signatures you need to get on the ballot a number of times. So in 1935, this is right after Prohibition, Arkansas says that all counties are wet, but if you want to become a dry county, you have to collect signatures equal to 35% of the electorate to get on the ballot. That's a pretty high requirement, 35%. And when that change comes in 1935, essentially there are no elections held. It's just too hard to meet that signature threshold. So a couple of years later, 1942, the legislature changes it, and this is actually an initiated act. So there's a statewide initiated act to lower the voting threshold. And here they lower it from 35 down to 15%. So now you only need signatures of 15% of the registered voters to get on the ballot. And immediately after that, there are 40 county elections held. There's 75 counties in Arkansas. So under this new rule, 40 hold elections and become dry. And there's 32 of those succeed to make them dry counties. So right away after this law passes, you got 32 dry counties. And then another handful of counties over the years will pass them to get to the point now you're getting up pretty close to modern times. So you essentially, though, have a lot of these votes. It's a pretty low signature threshold. And these elections come up all the time in cities and counties. And some legislators say that this is essentially tearing communities apart. This is a very contentious issue. Some people are very pro-dry. Some are very pro-wet. And so we're going to essentially try to stop this practice So in 1993, they raised that threshold back up to 38%. So now you need signatures of 38% of the registered voters, which if you think about, if only about half of people turn out in a typical election, you're essentially asking for what's a supermajority of people who actually vote to sign these petitions. So, that's how we get to where we are kind of today is after Prohibition, all the counties in Arkansas are wet. More than half of them vote themselves dry under one particular rule. And then they changed the rule to make it a lot harder to hold these elections.
So things were sort of fixed in place by this rule change, but they were fairly flexible before, or frequently changing at least.
Right. So this change happens in 1993, and it for the most part, kind of stops these local elections from happening. Not completely, but they're much less frequent. You get one in, I think in 1996, there's an attempt to put one on the ballot, but they don't even get it on the ballot. It's not until 2006 that there's actually one that gets on the ballot. So it does stop these elections from happening for about 13 years until you get kind of some movement to get these things on the ballot. But then really in the last few years, so between 2012, 2014, and 2016, we actually have a lot of these happening in a lot of counties. One of the reasons is you get kind of, I guess what you might call another bootlegger here, but on the opposite side, you essentially get groups like Walmart coming in, and Walmart wanting to be able to sell beer and wine, because they can't sell liquor. Remember I said they can only have one liquor store, but they want to be able to sell beer and wine in their Walmart stores in every county. So Walmart starts essentially bankrolling these petition drives, which before that, this was just way too expensive for anyone to try and do it themselves. So that's kind of what's happened really since 2012. Walmart's got involved in this and has got it on at least in a few more counties, got them on the ballot. And so then you have had a lot of both failed petition drives and successful ones happening mostly in the past couple of years.
Interesting. See, that's a part of the interesting part about the story for me of the Bootleggers and Baptists is under the status quo, there are a lot of bootleggers or people who know that they benefit from the way things are. If you're running that liquor store right on the edge of a wet county, right next to the border to a dry county, that you benefit from this situation. But the person who would own a liquor store in a dry county if it were wet probably doesn't realize that could benefit from this, or that in some alternate reality they would be benefiting. It's too uncertain. But with something like Walmart having already made the investment to put a whole store to sell everything except beer and wine, you now get someone who has the information to know that they would benefit under something other than the status quo. So that's a really interesting sort of pattern. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, as far as someone who's there yet, you could have someone who would say, "Oh, well, I would like to open a liquor store. I don't have one right now. So I'm going to go out and collect all these signatures, or I'm going to hire these groups to come in and collect signatures for me. So I have, maybe I can get this law changed, and then maybe I can open a liquor store." That's just not going to happen, right? But now that you have Walmart, who's not only based in Arkansas, but you've got a Walmart in I believe every single county in Arkansas, but certainly in the counties they've been targeting, they have locations. You also have convenience store chains. So Come and Go is actually a convenience store chain based in Iowa, but they have a lot of locations already in Arkansas. So they would like to be able to, they already have the store set up. They're probably at convenient locations where people would like to buy it, and they would like to be able to sell that. So they have an interest in moving this thing forward. Whereas without them, without these chain retailers of other sorts, there'd be no one that has an interest in doing this other than a group of citizens getting together and saying, "Hey, we'd all like to be able to not have to drive to the next county. Let's all go collect signatures and let's campaign for this." Especially that high of a signature threshold, that just really doesn't happen. And so now that for whatever reason Walmart has decided to get involved in this, that they're one of the main forces pushing it forward to have more elections and more counties.
Yeah. The interest group that is hardest to organize is the consumers. There are just too many of them, and each of them has too small of a stake.
Yeah, so in a sense, Walmart is acting on the consumer's behalf, which, say that to some people might be a little bit controversial, but that is essentially what they're doing here, right? They're saying, hey, there are consumers in your county who would like to buy these products, and we're going to essentially be their voice. Now, we'll make money doing it, of course. So in a sense, they are a bootlegger of a sort, but they are a bootlegger that is trying to expand choice rather than restrict it.
Yeah. So let's dig into the specific data you have on this, on these elections. What kind of information were you able to get? Were you able to get the names? Were you able to see exactly how many people signed each of these petitions? Were you able to see exactly who was donating to which organizations and which campaigns?
Yeah, so Arkansas has pretty strict disclosure requirements for anyone that's spending money on one of these ballot questions. They call them ballot question committees, is the legal term in Arkansas. And so if you're going to, advocate for or against any sort of ballot initiative, not just alcohol, but anything, whether it's local, whether it's a statewide constitutional amendment, you're legally required to form one of these ballot question committees. And then you have to keep detailed records on both who gives you money as well as what you're spending the money on. So that's the main data I'm working with. As far as, who's signing the petitions, I haven't, collected any of that data, but there are some interesting things with the petitions too. But the main data I'm working with is who is contributing to these ballot question committees. And I can also look at what they're spending money on.
Interesting. So you already alluded to the fact that that the liquor stores in wet counties are donating to initiatives to stop dry counties from going wet, and so you just see their name just published with their donation amount.
Generally, yes. Sometimes they do use intermediaries to do it. So there's one that's called it's the last name family. It's whatever family trust donated money to this. You think, well, what is this? Well, it doesn't take that long with a little bit of Google work to figure out. Oh, that's the family that owns this county line liquor store. But in some cases, it will just be the name store. So we'll just say Shamrock Liquor Store gave $100,000 to this campaign, and so the data is that detailed that you do see who gave all this money. It's interesting. It's all handwritten, and I don't know if there's any verification, but they seem to be in most cases honestly just putting it all down and saying, yes, this liquor store gave to this campaign, or Walmart when they're giving to the the pro legalization campaigns, they say Walmart gave this money to this, or in some cases it's members of the Walmart family that did in a few specific instances. But you do have information on that. So as well as if it's churches, right? So there are churches that give much smaller amounts than the liquor stores do, but you still see those show up. So they'll say, First Baptist Church gave $1,000 to this campaign, and that will show up on these records.
Interesting. And you casually mentioned a liquor store giving $100,000. I assume that's an example, but is that a typical amount? What kind of dollar figures are we seeing for these donations? Yeah,
so typically when the liquor stores get involved, and they don't always, when they do get involved though, you're typically seeing amounts of between $100,000 and $300,000 given to any particular county campaign when the liquor stores do get involved. And a lot of that will just come from one or two liquor stores. So they are giving six figures. That's coming from one, essentially mom and pop liquor store in one county, giving what's, I don't know what share of their annual revenue that is, but it's not a token amount.
Yeah, well, I mean, that just seems like so much for a single location liquor store. But when you think about it in spatial terms, a single liquor store in a city with many liquor stores maybe services, one sort of large neighborhood. If it's particularly dense, it could be a lot of people. But then a liquor store that is on the main highway just outside of an entire dry county, potentially services and a lot of people, potentially is the main source of liquor for a huge number of people. So maybe that amount is not unreasonable. But when you think about the fact that this vote or this ballot initiative could be the difference between your business staying in business and shutting down, the amount you should be willing to pay should be, up to your entire future discounted value of your business.
Yeah, or up to the amount that you think you would lose by this change happening. Yeah,
yes,
yeah. I think it could be even more, right? You might think, $100,000. Why aren't they even spending more?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
right. They may also face credit constraints. I don't imagine that you could pay. Well, I mean, presumably they own their buildings and they could mortgage them to make extremely large investments, or investments in these campaigns. But yeah, it seems like a lot of money, but who knows? Maybe it's not. Maybe they're making earning millions of dollars and giving just 100,000 is not a huge portion. I don't suppose you have profit numbers for these businesses.
No, we don't. These are privately held small businesses. We don't have their income statements, but in some cases they do actually get. Some of these campaigns do get loans, but they're not bank loans; they're personal loans. So a lot of times the people that are starting these initiatives will essentially loan money. And it's not $100,000, but it's $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 in loans will come from the people that start these campaigns. They'll make personal loans to it, which will then they hope to be paid back from others will donate. They kind of salt the kitty, and they put a little money in first to show they're serious and hope that it'll get repaid at the end.
Okay, so we've talked about where the form of the data and the amounts for the bootleggers. Do you then presumably know how many people were signing each of these petitions or in each of the counties? So what kind of patterns do we see with the Baptists?
Sure. So with the Baptists, the pattern we see is these are the church groups. With the Baptists, we see that they only donate money in cases where there's essentially no bootlegger. So in some of these counties, for whatever reason, some counties actually, because we have so many dry counties in Arkansas, some dry counties don't even border another wet county. So they might only border dry counties. Or sometimes there may just be no county line liquor store. So in some of the cases, there's essentially no bootlegger giving any money. And in those cases, then the churches do step up and donate money. But if there is already some liquor stores that are putting money to fighting this, then churches never give money. So you actually never see, in terms of the money, there's no explicit coalitions of both liquor stores and churches donating to these local initiatives. But usually it's one or the other. There are very few examples where there's essentially no one fighting it in terms of money. But the churches, the Baptists, only step in when there's no bootlegger to fight it. But the churches do, and for this you need to go through, look at the local newspaper and read, who's talking about it, who are they interviewing, who's writing letters to the editor. Churches do still provide support in most of these cases, even if a liquor store is funding the opposition. But as far as who's giving money, churches only step in when it seems like there's no one else to fund it.
Right. So the churches or the church groups may provide a lot of volunteer hours, and those aren't dollars, but since we're economists, we can convert them into dollars. That person who is spending time writing a letter to the editor or canvassing door to door presumably has an opportunity cost. They could be working, they could be doing something else, and you could put a dollar value on that, and it presumably would be substantial if they're spending a lot of time on this.
Yeah, absolutely. But in terms of actual money they give, it's typically around $10,000. I think the biggest I've seen is $27,000. But so it's an order of magnitude smaller than what the liquor stores are giving. So $10,000 is pretty typical sum total for all the churches that are donating on the one side of this.
So what can you tell me about the success or failure of these petition drives? Have you looked at how effective these donations and these campaigns are? Bootleggers that give more money able to successfully prevent counties from going wet?
Yeah, so when I started this project, I was thinking, well, maybe they do some regressions and see how much they have to give to increase their chances this much. But in the end, I found some just pretty clear patterns that I thought were just interesting on their own. And one is that in almost every case, except for one, so there's about there's 20 some cases here. There's only one case where a bootlegger was unable to stop a county. There's one case where a bootlegger failed to prevent a county from going wet. In all the other cases where the bootlegger steps in, the county line liquor stores essentially, where they step in and spend money, they're almost always able to defeat these things and stop them from passing. So there's one case, and this is one where Walmart ended up spending a lot of money on just one county and focusing on just that one county. In that case, Walmart was able to prevail, but otherwise, the county line liquor stores are pretty much always able to. Really, what they do is they prevent these things from getting on the ballot, and that's where the 38% signature threshold comes in as being really important. Essentially, what they do kind of two things. You might think, well, what are they spending this money on, right? What are they spending $100,000 or $200,000 on in a local election? One, of course, is advertising, right? They're going to try to convince people, in this case, convince them not to even sign the petition, because that ends up being the the thing that stops most of these from passing. So they advertise, say, don't sign this petition, and sometimes it's taking out billboards, and they'll try to essentially in some cases scare people and say, if you sign this petition, your name will be part of the public record, so don't do it. But the other thing they spend money on is lawyers. So an important part of these signature drives is that these ballot question committees can challenge signatures in court. So when the signatures are submitted to the local county clerk, essentially you can challenge them. And the way you collect signatures, I'm sure most people have done this, right? There's a sheet and it's got a couple dozen names on it, and then once that sheet's full, they do the next sheet. Well, there's essentially in Arkansas, if you can challenge one name on any sheet as being wrong, either they're from out of county, it's a made-up name. If there's like one wrong name on a form, that whole form gets thrown out. Or you can challenge, a lot of times, the pro-wet groups, so say Walmart, will hire groups from out of state to come and collect signatures. But there's a lot of things you have to do in order to get certified as a signature collector. So another thing they'll challenge in court is whether the people went through all the proper steps before they started collecting signatures, or whether this John Smith was collecting signatures on February 26th, but he wasn't certified till March 1st. So you got to throw out all his signatures. So the lawyers are actually what they end up spending a lot of money on. And so what the bootleggers are able to do is to both get people to not sign, or for those that do sign, they get the signatures thrown out. It's a really high threshold anyway. And, if you come to the end of the signature collection period and you've just barely met that, 38% requirement, and then, a couple of your sheets get thrown out, you basically have no time to kind of collect the remaining signatures. So that's what bootleggers are spending their money on. And again, as I said, in every case that they've stepped forward and tried to do this, except for one, where Walmart spent a lot of money on the other side. Walmart spent money on their own lawyers and their own signature collectors. In all the other cases, the bootleggers have been able to prevent these things from getting on the ballot. And that's really important because of all the ones where I have data, I've got, I believe, 10 counties now where it has succeeded. In every single case, if it gets on the ballot, it passes, which kind of makes sense if you think about, 38% of the registered voters have signed this. That means of people who will turn out, already over half of them are on board with this. I mean, I suppose some people might sign it and say, I'm undecided. I just want it to go up for a vote. Most people that sign these things are in favor of it, I would assume. So in all the cases where it did get on the ballot in a county, it passed. And so all the cases where the bootlegger wins are by preventing it from getting on the ballot.
Okay. So, so that's interesting. Here, I was just picturing, grassroots kind of, people going door to door and knocking on doors, and of course that did happen. But of course there were lawyers involved in anything like this, and rules and regulations and backroom things happening. Yeah, I'm looking at your table too, and so for listeners, that one case where a bootlegger failed to stop a county from going wet was Saline County in 2014, it looks like, and the bootlegger spent over $150,000, but Walmart or the other side spent more than $500,000. So it's kind of dramatic.
Yeah, and in this case, actually, so Walmart spent $1.5 million on 3 different counties, but they stopped working on 2 counties at some point and just focused on Saline County. So I put $500,000 there as a third of the $1.5 million, but they probably spent more than $500,000 on this one county. So yeah, they outspent the liquor stores by quite a bit, and in that case, Walmart was able to get enough signatures to get on the ballot, and they were able to, it did pass.
Right, and this part of what you're illustrating with your description of the way they can cancel signatures and throw petitions into question, it seems like it's very asymmetrical. So $1 spent trying to get the wet, to get the petition to succeed and to have the ballot initiative succeed, it seems like your dollar would maybe be less effective because you can't, lawyers can invalidate signatures, but they can't create signatures out of thin air.
Yeah, so for the pro-legalization side, marginal dollar is much better spent on hiring someone to collect the signatures. But then as far as, if a judge says they're going to throw out this sheet, I suppose you could try to make a case that, no, really, John Smith does live in this county, so a signature should count. It's generally pretty cut and dry if a sheet should be thrown out. Again, remember that they're not just throwing out the one name that was wrong; they're throwing out the entire sheet, which would include many more names. So that law exists. There's nothing hiring a lawyer at this point can do to change it in a particular case.
One wonders why they haven't moved to having fewer or a larger using more paper so that you can have a smaller number of signatures on a larger number of sheets in order to avoid this problem of more sheets being thrown out.
Yeah, maybe just one name per sheet, right?
at a certain point, it just won't fit on a clipboard. But yeah, and unless there's some kind of regulation signature sheet, which I
believe.
I would imagine that would make life easier.
Yeah, I need to look into that as far as there is a form you have to use, but could you just put one name on a sheet? I don't know. Maybe I'm sure Walmart's thought of this, but so far they still follow the standard practice of just filling up the sheet and then moving on to the next one.
So let's move to the conclusion. Are there general lessons we can draw from this? Things that would be relevant to people outside of Arkansas, just trying to understand the way politics works in general?
Yeah, and so I think we can go back to the Bootlegger and Baptist framework. As I said, it was a short article from 1983 that Bruce Yandel wrote. He actually expanded that into a full book on Bootleggers and Baptists that was released 2 or 3 years ago. It was co-authored with his grandson Adam C. Smith, not Adam Smith back from the dead. But in that book they give a lot of examples of other issues that they think fit this framework. And one of the things that they emphasize is that not only is this a winning coalition that's very successful, in many cases it's kind of necessary. And so they go through a lot of these examples and say, that without both sides, without the financial backing, as well as without the kind of moral cover for this or the moral argument for a particular law, that they argue it wouldn't be possible for a lot of these legal and regulatory changes to happen. So I think that's one thing we can learn, is that anytime you see something passed, there's almost always going to be an identifiable bootlegger and Baptist. Now, that doesn't make it, wrong in some way. The point of this framework is not to say that, well, if you can identify this coalition, therefore it was bad, this thing passed. Instead, we're just trying to understand what makes things more likely to pass. And so, say in many cases, if all you have is the moral argument for or against something, and there's no kind of bootlegger spending, you're unlikely to get political change, right? You do need some financial backing. But if all you have is financial backing, if you don't have at least some good argument, possibly moral argument, but at a very minimum, that's also unlikely to pass. So the kind of winning strategy, of course, is to have a bootlegger, the money, and a Baptist, a good argument. But if we think about any change in law, of course, there'll often be a bootlegger and Baptist on both sides of the thing, right? There's going to be financial interests at stake on both sides. So then the more interesting question is, what's the relative importance of each in any particular coalition? Are there different coalitions that might be more important when you're trying to get something repealed versus get a new law put into place? There's all kinds of interesting questions like that. But I think those are, some kind of general rules we can think about that might apply to lots of different changes in law or regulation.
Yeah, and it's all really interesting. You sometimes see crazy examples like licensed medical marijuana sellers actually campaigning against marijuana legalization because the current system protects them from competition, which is kind of, again, it's a strange bedfellows are the words that come up frequently. It's these bootleggers and Baptists don't have to like each other. They don't have to be ideologically aligned. They just need to have a single goal in common and work towards it in their own different, sometimes connected, but sometimes not ways.
Yeah, and you see this a lot. In fact, I've got an interesting quotation from a minister in Arkansas who's been, trying to fight. In fact, we haven't talked about this yet, but there was actually a statewide campaign to legalize all alcohol sales back in 2014 as well in Arkansas. That failed. And the churches got involved in that too. And one minister who was involved in that, he said, I've teamed up with feminists to fight pornography, and I've teamed up with casinos in Mississippi to fight casinos in Arkansas, and I'll team up with anyone to advance what I think is right. And so he made it very clear that that he's aware that these are strange coalitions, but he has objectives he's trying to achieve, this minister, and he'll team up with anyone who can help him, especially if they've got either money or pull. But he wasn't shy about it.
Yeah. I think there's I think when we're actually engaged in political activism, often we don't see the money that's on our own side. We only see it on the other side, and there's this sort of sense that my side are all high-minded moral crusaders, and the other side are all corporate shills or something, and it's an important realization that, whichever side you happen to be on, you probably have both, unless your side is just hopelessly quixotic and never ever wins, in which case maybe you are only moral crusaders.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially look at candidates running for office, they both have money, and sometimes someone will say, oh, this guy had more money than that guy. But a lot of the research on this shows is that it's not the absolute amount of money you have. More spending there's some evidence that matters at the margin, but the absolute amount of money doesn't seem to predict who will win races and other things like that. Yeah, but people, if you lose, you're always going to point to that, especially if the other person outspent you, the other group. You say, if only we'd had their amount of money, or if only we could restrict how much money they spend, then our side, the moral side, would win. But it takes money to run any sort of campaign. And so it seems a little strange to point to the money the other side spent when, of course, your side spent some money too. But I think it's normal for people to say that, but I think we have to caution against that as kind of an argument that can explain everything.
My guest today has been Jeremy Horpedahl. Jeremy, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Oh, thank you very much. I enjoyed it a lot.
The discussion question for this episode is, can you name a bootlegger and Baptist coalition other than the ones we mentioned in the episode? Bonus points if you can name one that you are at least sympathetic towards. It's easy to point at the other side and say, see, they are in bed with corporate interests, or they are allies of this self-interested group. But if you can look at your own side and see the same thing, that's much harder. And if you want to join the discussion, answer that question or one of the other discussion questions that I've asked in other episodes, or even just to ask an economics question or pose a problem to the group, you can join my Facebook group, Economics Detective, on Facebook. That's the group Economics Detective, so search those words and request to join. It's a closed group, but I haven't so far prevented anyone from entering it, so you just need to answer a couple questions and I'll let you in and you can answer the discussion question. So I hope to see you there soon.